Welcome back, folks. We appreciate you joining us today. As mentioned, we are going to get started a little bit earlier than the agenda stated, and we do appreciate the comments thus far. Some concerns raised about the pace of this initiative for the first phase on the co-located piece, as well as some clarifications on how it would work with the NGR model. And, of course, we appreciate all of the other substantive clarifications that were asked, especially in light of the remote work that we're all doing these days. So with that, Gabe, feel free to continue.
Thank you, Jimmy. And I would also echo those comments. I am very appreciative of the dialogue that we're having today and the discussion on this topic. I think there's a lot of things that have been pointed out where we can make some improvements and we can make some clarifications, and there might need to be some additional work that happens for fall 2020 as well. And we're going to stay dialed into that, but it's definitely nice to have this dialogue. So I just want to say thank you again for everybody who's participating in this initiative, both on this phone call and with written comments to follow up this paper. So I really appreciate that. Additionally, I know we did get cut short a little bit on some of the questions at the end of the last session. To the extent that folks have any questions and we do wrap up with some additional time, we can take those questions at the end of the presentation. With that said, I will start in on the part of the presentation related to the co-located resources. I think this part of the presentation may go a little bit faster than the earlier part, but I think it all, again, depends on the dialogue that we're having with some of the questions and the concerns. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Again, we have a phased implementation plan for hybrid resources, which includes developing new tools that would go in place in fall of 2020, and then updated tools that would be implemented in fall of 2021. The concept of co-located resources does exist today, but it's a little bit of a different framework than what we've been talking about on majority of this call. Essentially today, for all of the co-located resources that we have on the system, the aggregate of the Pmax values for those resources is less than or equal to the point of interconnection limit for those co-located resources. And these are, again, established when they come to the ISO and go through the interconnection process. We are planning to relax this rule with the changes that we're envisioning from this initiative. And for resources, co-located resources, that join the system that aren't subject to this constraint, they will be subject to a new constraint called the Aggregate Capability Constraint. This constraint essentially prevents combined energy from resources from exceeding interconnection limits. So again, in that example where I had a 100 megawatt solar resource, resource A, and a 50 megawatt storage resource, resource B, they're both behind the same point of interconnection, and that point of interconnection is only 100 megawatts. Well, the idea would be that this aggregate capability constraint would limit the output from both resources to 100 megawatts during any given interval. Now, that might not matter very much in the middle of the night when the solar can't produce, but certainly during the middle of the day, if the solar resource could potentially produce at full output and the storage component is fully charged, it could be imagined if prices were to spike up, that those resources could potentially produce above that point of interconnection limit. The constraints will be enforced on both the upper and the lower interconnection limits. So there could be multiple storage resources with the ability to individual P minimums that would be below the interconnection limit for how much energy a resource or group of resources could take off of the grid. And then resources would generally also be allowed to operate under the paradigms in place today. So if there were a group of co-located resources, max of those co-located resources was less than the point of interconnection, then we would still allow those resources to be on the market and to operate under the same paradigm today, where each would have their own resource ID and they would each be able to bid in the market, and they would not be subject to the aggregate capability constraint. So clarification on the implementation here, we are planning to unroll the initial implementation in the fall of 2020, and this is a constraint that would only include energy dispatch from co-located resources, whereas the full proposal would be developed and ready for use in the fall of 2021. This would include both energy and ancillary services in the limit for co-located resources. So on the next slide, this basically outlines the formulas that we will be including in the aggregate capability constraint that's implemented in this year. And essentially what it says is that the summation of the energy from all the resources can't exceed the upper limit at the POI, or similarly, the summation of the energy dispatches from the resources can't exceed in the negative direction the lower limit for the resource. So on slide, I'm sorry, not the resource, the point of interconnection. So the next slide is the full constraint that would be implemented in the fall of 2021. Essentially, instead of just having the summation be inclusive of energy, it would also include ancillary services. So there's more terms that would be added together that must be maintained below a specific limit. And again, these would both be constrained in the upper limit and the lower limit. And I think Mike Castellano pointed out that, you know, these implementations may be relatively similar, so why not just implement the full one? I do think that we are planning to implement this second formula prior to fall of 2021, and we're going to have it in the testing environment so that we can make sure that there's no unintended consequences from introducing this into the cost minimization problem that the market optimizes for. So with that, I think that kind of outlines our proposal for the aggregate capability constraint. With that, I'll just pause and take any questions on that topic before we get into pricing for this.
All right. We do have two callers on the line. Caller, go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. So I think maybe the best way for me to begin with my concerns is to ask a question, and that's what is the goal that the CAISO is trying to achieve with this constraint? Is it either that it wants to give resource owners the flexibility to bid in more than, you know, or I guess bid in and relax that Pmax constraint and more flexibility in bidding, or is the goal for the CAISO to want to optimize the resources behind the interconnection?
No, I think from what we've seen and some of the discussion that we've already had today, you know, we do see a lot of storage resources that want to co-locate with solar resources. I think there's some cost savings opportunities there because the solar resource may already have the inverter built, they may already have the interconnection established with the ISO, so there may be a minimum amount of additional work to sort of site and install and, you know, receive RA credit for a storage capacity that's at the same location as a solar resource. So I think there is a value proposition there for storage resources. It's also somewhat convenient because the hours of greatest need on the system aren't generally, and the hours that we see the highest prices, but those generally don't coincide with the hours when we have the maximum amount of output from solar resources. So we think that this could also be, you know, a big win for, you know, some synergies there as well. You know, I would say that the real goal of this tool is to make sure that if we do have these co-located resources, that the aggregate output of the co-located resources doesn't exceed the POI. That's really what we're trying to get at here.
Okay, that's helpful. So then what's the difference in the outcome between putting in a market constraint and just having a rule that says your bids cannot exceed your interconnection?
Oh, so this would allow bids to exceed the interconnection. So that's one obvious difference. But the other thing,
but we don't need your bids to exceed your interconnection, right? Like because you're going to cap the bids, you're not going to take the resources for more than the interconnection level. So there's no benefit to people bidding beyond their interconnection amount. So I guess I'm just asking, practically speaking, what's the difference between a constraint and then a rule that just says you can't in aggregate bid more than your interconnection?
Well, I mean, I think this sort of gets back to Adam's point in the last conversation we had about, you know, the economics of the system actually making a determination about which resource should run or which resource shouldn't run, and that's what would happen here. So even though you might have multiple resources behind one POI, the ISO's optimization model is still going to pick the least expensive one to generate first before all the other more expensive resources.
But if you're a scheduling coordinator and you're bidding into resources, you'll already know your bids and your economics, and so you'll know which one will be taken before another. So whether I'm a generating resource and I do a monotonic bid for both resources, or the ISO limits it through this constraint, the outcome for the resource owner is the same. They're still choosing which resources to be taken first by the CAISO. And the outcome from the CAISO is the same, right? Because they still see the same bids. They're still picking up the same resources first.
Yeah, I don't know if that's entirely true. So if one of the resources is a VER resource and the amount that it can produce over a period of time changes, you know, it's not just one bid that's coming from one schedule. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit confused about the scenario here that you're outlining.
If you have a really simple scenario, you have a solar. Oh, go ahead, John.
Carrie, this.
Gabe, I was just going to say that the advantage is that we allow the overall Pmax to exceed that POI for the two resources. That's the advantage.
The aggregate, yeah.
Carrie, this is Deb. Let me jump in. Remember the discussion at the last stakeholder meeting that we had, that the way that we currently have co-located or hybrid resources in the master file is that the megawatts can't exceed the POI. So if you have 100 megawatt solar and a 50 megawatt battery, and you only have 100 megawatts the POI, what the master file was doing was putting in 50 megawatts of the 100 megawatts at the POI. So it was putting in 75 megawatts of solar and 25 megawatts of battery as the Pmax for each piece. And the discussion that we had with the stakeholders is that's not workable. We need to be able to float between the solar and the battery, and so that's why we came up with this aggregated constraint. So it would allow us to put both Pmaxes into the master file, but then go ahead and have the constraint such that you can only have an output of 100.
Right, but what's the difference between a constraint and simply allowing the Pmaxes to be outside and above the POI and just making a rule that says your bids can't exceed your interconnection, your offers? Why, I'm asking why you need a market constraint to do it, and you can't either just have a rule or do what you're doing for the hybrids and have it at the bid level. Because when you do it as a market constraint rather than a resource bid level, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So what do I do when interval number 1 of an hour, I have a solar resource that can produce 80 megawatts. And interval number 2 of the hour, I have a solar, and then I have a 50 megawatt battery and a 100 megawatt interconnection. And then interval number 2, I have a solar resource that can dispatch up to 85 megawatts. How do you? I mean, the bid curve is fixed for the entire hour. So how do I change that bid curve from interval 1 to interval 2? That's what's not making sense to me.
Yeah, so, I mean, you could do it a couple ways. Because it's a co-located resource, you could treat it like any other aggregated resource in the system and just chop off their bid at the top, just like you were proposing with hybrids. So you do it on the bid side. So you have a monochrome bid stack from the 2 co-located resources, and you have an aggregated bid, and you will allow it to vary. And you constrain it to... Like you're making it, I guess, I mean, it's a kind of a nuanced mathematical point, but you're doing a market constraint. I'm asking you why you're doing it on the market side and not on the resource bid side.
Yeah, but I think the problem is that there's not just one bid curve, it's 2 bid curves. So you have the bid curve in the first interval for 80 megawatts for the solar resource and 20 megawatts for the battery. And then in the second interval, you'd have a bid curve of 85 megawatts for the solar resource and 15 megawatts for the battery. So it's not, you're not just changing one bid curve, you're changing 2 bid curves.
Well, so the CAISO already has, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be really clear. The CAISO already has a model to handle that. It's called the Aggregated Resource Model, right? And you could, it's similar to MSG, right? You could set up your resources as aggregated resources. And the CAISO already has a model for that. And it already addresses employee services.
Yeah, and I think
we
decided on this
maybe this is like Mike's point. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I just said I think for this particular point, we've sort of gone down the route of deciding to model this as a constraint in the market and not do something where bids would be modified.
I know, and I don't mean to be rude, but I don't think you guys did that thoughtfully. I think you did that without exploring other options. And I think that's creating more complications on getting this implemented. And I just think if you just took a quick step back and explored different ways to model this, we could have this implemented really quickly in the fall with ancillary services.
Okay, so maybe we need to have you and I could have a conversation, and some other folks at the ISO could have a conversation about other possibilities for modeling this. That might be more expeditious to implement.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And then my second point on this one is that going back to the discussion we had before, I think I lost a lot of people, and it's applicable to co-located resources too. So my example is that you have a point of interconnection, and it's 100 megawatts. And you don't just have 2 resources behind it, you have 4 resources behind it, and 2 of the resources are owned by one entity, and 2 of the resources are owned by the other. So that's the example I was trying to get at, where people have bought a portion of the interconnection, and if you do this constraint, everyone's able to bid up to their Pmax, you're actually forcing companies to compete for interconnection space that they already bought. We don't need to talk about it more on the call, but I got a bunch of emails over lunch, and people didn't understand what I was saying. So I just want to be really clear. It's not one, and I know you understand it, but I think we missed a lot of people on the call, and it's a really big point because recently with the MMA changes and the deliverability assessment, there was basically a land grab. And what most solar developers did is they split their solar and they added storage, and so now all these interconnections are broken up in ways that was probably never envisioned originally. And so what will happen to people's contracts if they're not wary about this is that they'll have bought 100 megawatts of interconnection, and if someone bids cheaper than them right next door, they're not going to get access to that interconnection. And I don't know if that's your problem to solve, but I think it's something that the industry needs to understand because that's an implication of this proposal. And maybe it's completely resolved your contract, but I just wanted to make it really transparent on what I was talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I appreciate the additional clarification. I would like to spend some more time thinking about this specific problem, and yeah, maybe, you know, I don't know what the ISO's position is going to be on it, but I think we should certainly, it does seem like something we should take into consideration and maybe spill a little bit of ink on in the next version of the paper to try to address. But I appreciate the bringing up. No, thank you, Carrie. Operator, another call?
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, it's Eric. Hey, I just want to congratulate you on taking on the least controversial topic that the ISO has going on right now. I hope you don't take all the comments personally. I don't think any of them are directed at you. This is just a difficult topic to get through, so thank you for being a good sport in all of it. On this issue about the bidding and the constraint, I guess I'm not quite as convinced as Carrie. This actually looks to me a lot like the way that you manage congestion. So if you had two resources behind a constraint, you simply take the more cost-effective of the two until you reach the congested point. I do understand that if somebody has deliverability, did they pay for the interconnection? And I suppose, by and large, that payment is mostly about being counted for resource adequacy. Even a fully deliverable resource can be congested off, can it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Eric, I think the explanation that you've just given there is pretty much what we've envisioned. This is very similar to what we're using for constraints in the market to model physical, like line constraints as well. So we just kind of expanded that here to include the POIs. And like I said, I do think I want to sort of understand Carrie's concern a little bit more, and I'll be looking into that more after this call. But I am also thinking very much along your lines that, you know, yeah, the bidding obligations are still going to be there, even though your resource might not get selected. You know, you may not be able to deliver on to a particular POI because some other less expensive resource already has sort of been awarded those rights in the real-time market. But again, I want to understand the problem a little bit more before I say. And yes, I always try to avoid controversy, so nothing I do is controversial.
All right, and I do appreciate understanding other alternatives as well. I just wanted to make sure that that you heard comments on the phone as well, that there are those of us who don't necessarily object to this element. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks for the comment, Eric. I appreciate that. Another caller, operator?
Yes.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I just a clarification based on the earlier discussion, and hopefully this was a pretty easy one to do. And so instead, if you've got a storage, say storage and solar, let's say they're two different resources, they're co-located resources, and you are, and they each have separate resource IDs, which they would under the co-located resources paradigm. So is there any way to, is there any way to signal that, for example, one should have preference over the other, like you want the renewables production to happen first before the storage, or is that something that just has to be done through some kind of coordination of the bid?
Yeah, it's the market mechanism that will decide which resource gets chosen, and it will be in merit order. So the least expensive resource will get dispatched first. So yes, if the scheduling coordinator was coordinating the bids for both resources, where you might think that the solar would generally be bid into the market at a cheaper price than the storage component would be bid in, and of course you could have multiple of any of these. But you're exactly right. The solar would sort of get taken first by the market, and then if prices were sufficiently high, the market would take the storage capacity up to the amount of the POI, at which point it would be limited by that. But,
okay, but are you limiting both to, it seems like there's almost two limits involved. If you've got solar and storage together, and and then you can't award, I mean, they each have their own limits as resource ID limits, right? as a Pmax or some kind of thing you're going to put in there for each resource ID, right?
Pmax, yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay. And the issue here is that the two Pmaxes together will exceed the POI, so the choice between them is going to just be based on economics, is what you're saying. That's all. That's all. There's no way to change that.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Operator, next call.
Caller, go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, this is Chris with CES, Chris Devin with CES. Just wanted to say thanks for all the detailed explanations today. I think you're getting a lot of tough questions. Sounds like you're doing a pretty good job of trying to respond, and I appreciate that. So thanks for that. My question was more of a clarifying question on this issue. Previously, the CAISO had suggested that this POI constraint that would be applied only for energy in the fall of 2020 would be basically an option for co-located resources that had overall installed capacity above their interconnection rights, and that they would be able to have the option to either select to choose to use this interconnection constraint and have their aggregate Pmaxes be in excess of that interconnection right, and then be able to participate for energy but not ancillary services, or be able to simply continue to use the current implementation where their Pmaxes must be limited to the overall aggregate point of interconnection limit, and then they could still provide ancillary services. Is that still the CAISO's intent under the proposal?
Yeah, that's exactly the intent. I think the idea here is that if you do choose to be modeled with P maximum, the aggregate P maximums above the POI, then we would put this constraint in place. And of course, the constraint that's going to be in place in fall 2020 only includes energy that's going to be coming from the resources. But if the aggregate values of the Pmax are less than the POI, then there's no problem with integrating with the grid today, and both or multiple resources, the co-located resources, would have the ability to provide ancillary services into the market. That's exactly right.
Okay, and I just wanted to specify get some clarification on that, because I think there were some other comments earlier where they were also wondering about that, and it wasn't totally clear to me. It kind of seemed like this presentation was indicating that they would be forced to not be able to provide ancillary services, that they wouldn't have the option of essentially reducing their Pmaxes in aggregate to that POI limit and then having the ability to still provide AS. And I think some of our clients have expressed some concerns over, still being able to have that need to provide AS. And so I think that helps clarify things, but I just wanted to make it clear for everyone on the call too. So thanks for that clarification. Appreciate it.
Yeah. No, good question. Thank you, Chris. Next caller, operator.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe. This is Mike Castellano with the Public Utilities Commission. I can't remember if we've talked about this before, but where's the P node for these resources located in relation to the POI constraint?
Yeah, I think that gets into the next few slides that I'm going to present, but essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pricing these as if they were sitting right at the POI rather than behind the POI. So essentially the prices from the shadow price wouldn't be included in the LMPs for these resources.
Okay, because one way you could address some of what Carrie was concerned about would be if you had the P node behind the constraint, which I think realistically is where it actually belongs probably, because you are constraining those resources. And then you could split the CRRs over that constraint in some way that would allow, if the price on the system side of the constraint is $50, you've got two resources that are bid at $20 and $25, each of which have a greater capacity than the total POI, but they have the POI rights split in some way. You're going to be dispatching one at 20 possibly for the whole POI. The $25 one is totally out of the money, but if it had some kind of rights to that revenue, you would resolve some of that.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'll think about that. Thank you. Yeah, I think those are good questions.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Carrie Bentley again. First, I just wanted to say I support Mike's idea about putting the P node behind the constraint. I think that also resolves the issue of having this artificial congestion that you're then ignoring. And then, two, if we were in a meeting right now and not, quarantined in our own homes, I would completely tease Eric Little and say, SCE is sure going to be pissed when they realize they bought, 100 megawatts and now they get to flow 0 megawatts because someone right next door took out all the rights instead. So, Eric, I appreciate that that's your position, but I might send you a note about your own storage contracts that I think will make you change your mind. That's all. Friendly teasing.
Thanks, Carrie. We all look forward to days when we won't be homebound by COVID and we can have more spirited discussions in person. Operator, any more calls?
Yes, caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Lorenzo Christoph. I'm participating in this meeting on behalf of GridLab. And it's really nice to hear the voices of many of my CAISO friends and many of my stakeholder friends again. I wanted to just make a couple of comments about this conversation that Carrie raised about separate scheduling coordinators and how to enforce the limits on it. And it seems to me that at least a portion of that issue ought to be settled within whatever is the co-tenancy contract that the two scheduling coordinators have for their rights at that POI. This is a question we faced in numerous instances at the ISO as to whether the ISO should be enforcing a constraint versus whether the private parties ought to be able to deal with it. And it seems to me that, and again, I don't know the whole story here about how the developers are looking at this, but from what I've been hearing through this initiative, seems to me that having the ISO enforce a POI constraint on the total dispatch really is the ISO's core function. Enforcing how two scheduling coordinators co-occupying a single point of interconnection share that capacity ought to be more a contractual relationship between those parties that is not so much up to the ISO to have to enforce. So I'm just suggesting that you look into that allocation of responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment, Lorenzo. I appreciate it. Operator, any other calls?
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. This is Albert Eugenio Good. So just 2 points. One is if you do go to the sort of more physical model where you have P nodes behind a constraint, it sounds to me like you'd have to essentially change the network model for that purpose. So there's a timing issue involved with that. So I'm just asking that question. And then sort of along the same lines, assuming that it's not, the implementation is done the way you're proposing, if there's an outage or a limitation on the deliverability at the point of interconnection due to physical limits, will you be able to, first of all, where will those limits be coming from? I'm assuming they'd come from the transmission OMS, but I wanted to check on that. And then would those be enforceable within the implementation of the model as you're proposing it right now? Thanks.
Oh, those are really good questions. And actually, I'm not, I think they dive fairly deeply into actual implementation. So I don't have a great answer right now, but I'm wondering if there are folks who are on the phone. There might be somebody on the phone right now from the ISO who could potentially address that. Is anybody on the line there, maybe from technology or somebody else who may know the answer to this one?
Thanks, Gabe. For any ISO folks listening in, you can push #2 for the operator to identify your line.
Okay. It doesn't sound like we have anybody here in the host room who has an answer to that, Alva. I think that's a very good question, though, and I will track that down and get you an answer if we don't hear from anybody who's perhaps listening in. Did you have another question, Alva?
No, that was all. Those were the two. Well, I mean, there were two questions. Okay. One was whether the alternative that's being proposed would actually potentially not be implementable this year because it would essentially require a rebuild of the network model that might not be possible in the time frame.
Yeah, I don't think I know the answer to that question at this point. But thank you for the question, and I will look into that. Operator, another question?
We have no further questions at this time.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next slide. Essentially, the constraints that we're envisioning implementing will limit, as we've talked about, the economic instructions sent to the co-located resources. And the key function of this constraint is to respect the POI limits. These constraints will prohibit resources from receiving a combined instruction exceeding the interconnection limits. And this, we've already discussed this, but this will be enforced similar to other constraints in the ISO market model, where the shadow price will be associated with the formula when the inequality binds. So when you're just at that limit, there will be a shadow price that indicates essentially the difference between the bid-in price of the resources behind the constraint and the prevailing price at the POI. The resources will be priced as if they were at the point of interconnection rather than behind it. And again, this was something that was proposed in the last version of the proposal, and I think we've heard some commentary on other potential ways to do it. But I think we're planning to stick with this direction for now. Of course, we will be reviewing the feedback that we've gotten on this call and feedback that we get in written comments as well. But we also want to just recognize that if we do implement the constraint in this way, it will introduce inconsistencies between dispatch instructions and prices, and that there could potentially be resources that may not be dispatched at their full Pmax, even though, there's missing a word there, prices are high during certain intervals. So you could have prices that are near $1,000, but because of the POI constraint, a specific resource behind that constraint may be seeing the $1,000 prices, but they may not be dispatched to their P maximum. Again, this is a concern for the ISO, and we've thought about some ways to sort of mitigate around those conditions. So if we go to the next slide, resources could be receiving high prices, but may not be dispatched to Pmax, which is what we just talked about. And this would potentially incentivize those resources to sort of produce beyond their instructions, which is the core of the concern for the ISO. We do want to just point out that we're planning on some safeguards to ensure that output is consistent dispatch going forward. First of all, co-located resources will be required to follow dispatch instructions. So we touched on this earlier today. Co-located resources that do not follow dispatch instructions may lose eligibility to use the aggregate capability constraint, and the ISO may revert them back to the current methodology where the sum of the sum of all the Pmaxes of the resource behind the constraint has to be less than the point of interconnection. I don't think we've really thought about, or we haven't specifically thought through criteria at which point we might contact a resource and say that they would sort of lose eligibility to have this constraint enforced for them and essentially have their P maximums reflect higher values than this constraint shown in this slide. But it could be, presumably there would be some contact between the ISO and market participants before we were to take any action like this, and we would see it as a fairly serious action. But by the same token, we do want to make sure that resources won't be exceeding their dispatch instructions, particularly if the POI is binding. Resources will be or continue to be required to have physical or electronic controls at interconnection to limit flows to contract levels. So when groups of resources come to the ISO and ask for interconnection rights, the standard practice is to have a physical control or an electronic control that prevents those resources from ever exceeding those limits. That's not going to change under this new paradigm. So those will still be there. And if resources are producing over those limits, then those runbacks or physical barriers could actually trigger, and that could potentially take the resource offline, which is, of course, not the outcome that the ISO wants. We want resources to be responding to dispatch instructions and to be maintaining safe operating limits at all times. The shadow price, with that said, the shadow price will not be applied to co-located resources. So one of the big concerns also around operations is exceptional dispatch tools. Today, they don't include POI constraints, or they wouldn't be expected in the future to include POI constraints. We've talked with or at least we've broached the topic with our technology team of the possibility of including this. But as it stands right now, we're not proposing that they do include this right now. The ISO is requiring that all co-located resources be operated by the same scheduling coordinator, and part of the reason for doing that is to alleviate some of these concerns. So the idea would be that instead of the ISO having to pick up the phone to notify resource A to increase output, it now, and possibly resource A and resource B are behind a co-located constraint, and then it would have to, sort of look up an operating rule just to make sure that we're not exceeding that, because all this would have to be done by hand, and then potentially pick up the phone and make a phone call to a second scheduling coordinator to maybe back down a resource to make sure that a limit is observed. The idea would be that, with one phone call to one scheduling coordinator, they'd be able to see and observe the limits on a POI. They'd be able to manage the resources behind the POI. If the ISO needed additional generating capability or needed resources to back down, the scheduling coordinator one scheduling coordinator would be able to do that easier than multiple scheduling coordinators for co-located resources. So that's the idea there. And I know we've already gotten some feedback on that, and I suspect we will get more feedback on that, but we want to keep an open dialogue about that as well. We may update our operating controls to accommodate this in the future. We think that there could be a technological solution to this. It's just not in place right now, and we haven't crafted a solution around this currently. So I'm going to go through one more slide, then I'll pause for questions. So beyond the aggregate capability constraint, we may need additional controls to always observe the POI constraints. So today, VER resources, so independent of co-located resources, they're allowed to produce as capable. So the VER resources are required to follow operating instructions, and they're required to follow negative supplemental dispatches when those come from the ISO. But otherwise, when there is no negative supplemental dispatch and there is no operating instruction, the resources are allowed to basically produce as capable or what they can with the fuel that they have, because the ISO recognizes that they're price takers generally. This implies that aggregate output from co-located resources could potentially exceed POI constraints. So remember, co-located resources have individual resource IDs for each of the resources that are behind the point of interconnection. So if I have a solar resource and I have a storage resource, and that solar resource, let's just say that prices are very high at the point of interconnection, so let's just say $1,000. Let's say, again, the solar resource is forecast to generate at 80, and that's what the POI, the aggregate capability constraint takes into consideration. Well, then the dispatch instruction that's going to be awarded to the storage component would be the remaining 20 megawatts of capability that's on the POI. Of course, what could actually happen is that solar component may actually produce, if it doesn't receive an explicit negative supplemental dispatch or operating instruction, it could be producing as capable, and it could actually produce 85 or 90 megawatts, which would, of course, then cause the summation of all the energy from the resources behind the POI to actually exceed the limits of the POI. Of course, this is particularly true when the POI constraint is binding. It need not be the case, though. It could be the case that, one solar resource could potentially produce more than the forecast, and then there's a small dispatch from a storage resource, and then additional variable output could potentially push this resource up above its POI limit. So there could be other cases as well. One solution to sort of resolve this problem is to explicitly state that co-located resources and the VER resources that are behind co-located resources must never exceed their forecast values. The ISO model uses forecast values as the expected energy that would be coming off of a particular variable energy resource. And this assumption could potentially be coupled with the POI constraint. I'm just going to point out that this is not the proposal that the ISO is going forward with. We think this is overly restrictive because we do anticipate that resources may want to produce as capable. This is existing functionality for all the resources on our system today. The ISO operations team does have some concerns about this, and we are looking at ways to sort of think about variable energy resources, and we may be discussing those further in the future. But today, they can produce as capable. Co-located resources could potentially need additional controls put in place to assure that POI limits are never exceeded, so that co-located VERs producing above their forecast do not cause aggregate generation to exceed POI limits. I do think that this is something that the ISO is willing to allow or to sort of put in the hands of folks who are operating co-located resources. And at this time, the ISO is not planning to add additional controls to require these limits. So that's sort of where we're at with this piece of the proposal. POI constraint will also be enforced by a physical limiter or a run-back established and verified during the ISO interconnection process. So really, I think, physically, these things may not be capable of actually producing more than their POI without sort of taking them offline. Again, that's not what the ISO wants here. So there may need to be some sort of internal system that could potentially limit or make limiting decisions when the joint resources are bumping up against those POI constraints. Okay, a lot of material there. I'll take a pause for questions.
We do have questions in the queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Well, I'm not going to repeat what I said about the single scheduling coordinator, other than it's pretty much a non-starter based on the way these things are scheduled. Now, but I want to start from the last point maybe and go backwards. So whenever you have, even if it's just a regular plain old generator, and often people do oversized things, put in extra inverters or things like that, and they are required to have one of these limiting physical limitations. And I gather from the last discussion we had from this that the ISO doesn't test these regularly. But I have a question. Since all resources have to provide telemetry, at least about the sizes that we're talking about probably here, since all resources have to provide telemetry, can you not tell when someone is producing above the POI limit?
I mean, this is, that would be more of a metering question, but yeah, we would be able to tell, yes.
Okay, so, and then that would, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, that would sort of be, we would be able to tell after the fact by reviewing our meter data. But not necessarily.
I'm not talking about meter data. I'm talking about real-time telemetry that you have to monitor all resources, right? I mean, would you not be able to tell when someone's going above their POI limit?
Yes, we would be able to tell through telemetry as well.
Okay, so, and if someone were to do that, that would violate their interconnection agreement, right, their GIA?
Correct.
Okay. So it seems like there is already what would seem like a fairly strong enforcement mechanism for something like that, and the ISO does have the ability to monitor it on a, I've forgotten, at least a 5-10 minute basis, whatever the telemetry is, I've forgotten off the top of my head. But it seems like that is, you actually have a structural control in place to make sure this doesn't happen. So, and again, I gathered from the last conversation that that isn't something that is tested or monitored regularly, but could it be tested and monitored regularly and enforcement effort exerted for something like that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. This is what you're saying is essentially our proposal is that, you know, the ISO certainly does have the ability to review telemetry information, meter information. We would certainly know if a resource or set of co-located resources was operating above its POI. We do agree with you. We think that the ISO saying that resources are not allowed to operate above their POI in this case is sufficient, particularly since we can review this information. And that's sort of what this slide is saying. We're not requiring further restrictions
right.
You know, outside of the proposed limitation that we're putting on the aggregate capability constraint.
Okay, and I think that
the economic.
It sounded like from the last conversation that the ISO did a spot check and found out that a lot of these weren't operational or something like that. So can we just assume that even though it's not in the document, that there is going to be some maybe stepped up effort? I don't think anyone would think this was unfair because it did, and people would sign agreements saying they would do this. So would there be some kind of stepped up effort by the ISO to enforce this that maybe has not happened up to now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak to what the ISO's enforcement of this policy will be going forward, but I do want to make sure that it's explicit that, you know, we're very serious about these rules, and we know that market participants have signed these kinds of rules previous to today, but going forward, you know, there might be even more scrutiny over, you know, this kind of information because we are sensitive to it, particularly with so much of this new capacity coming online.
Sure, and I think that seems very, very understandable. So let me ask you a question about just what seems like an inconsistency between two slides. On the slide you have up here, it says that, you know, this one solution is to require the co-located variable resources to oversee their forecast. That's not your proposal. So could you go back to the previous slide, please, and for slide 22? Okay, and slide 22 says all co-located resources will be required to follow dispatch instructions. But does this mean that if it's a there, then to the extent they do it today, meaning they are sometimes allowed to exceed that, it will be the same in the future? It was a little confusing to me because one time you're saying it's not our proposal to limit people to their forecast/dispatch instructions, but here it says they would have to file them. So does this just mean there would be no change? Is that what you meant to say here?
Yeah, I think that's a clearer way to put it. There is no change from the operations today. So most resources on the system do have to follow dispatch instructions. However, we know that the VER resources can produce as capable. Those rules aren't changing in the future.
Right. And when the VERs have a flag on the dispatch, they know they can't exceed the DOT, and that would still happen. And so this is not necessarily like a blanket statement. Okay. Because it's a little confusing to me. Now, I just have one more question. The shadow price, if you're talking about the shadow price not being applied, can you explain if you did decide to, and WTF sort of hinted at this, but if you did decide to apply a shadow price here, what would that mechanism look like?
Yeah, I mean, so this is basically the way that congestion is priced. This is similar to the mechanism that we use to price congestion in our market today for transmission elements. So basically, if we had, you know, let's just say we had $100 prices across the entire system, and the only thing that was binding was the amount of energy that was going to flow across the POI. So, you know, in the example we were talking about earlier, we've got resource A that's sitting in 100 megawatts at $20, and resource B that's sitting in 50 megawatts at $25. Well, if the POI is only 100 megawatts, then the marginal resource is resource A, and the price that they would actually observe if it was priced behind the POI would be $20 per megawatt hour, and the shadow price would be the difference between that price and the prevailing price on the grid, which would be, in this case, $20 and $100, the difference between the two, or $80. If instead, the two resources were, 75 megawatts for resource A and 75 megawatts for resource B, now suddenly the marginal resource is resource B, their marginal price is 25, so and that would be priced for both resource A and resource B, priced behind the constraint, and then the shadow price on the constraint itself would be $75, or the difference between 100 and 25.
Okay, so would the price to the resources be the 75? Or I was just trying to understand how would you be using the shadow price and to try and figure out which resources is dispatched?
Yeah, the price that both resources behind a co-located constraint that they would receive would be the prevailing price on the grid minus the shadow price that would be applied for the POI limit, the POI constraint, and essentially it would be the marginal cost for whatever that resource was to operate. So if the marginal cost was $25 for the marginal resource behind the POI constraint, then the price for all the resources behind the POI constraint would be $25 if they were priced behind the constraint instead of at the constraint.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I have.
Yep. Absolutely. Thanks, Susan. Next caller.
Your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe. This is Mike Castellano again. I just wanted to pick up something that Lorenzo said. I think he was talking about grid management being one of the key purposes of the ISO, and that's true, but another extremely important key purpose of the ISO as the entity that operates the wholesale market for, all of the stuff we're talking about is establishing prices. And if you guys price this in front of the constraint, the whole problem that you have here is you're creating the wrong price. So in my view, at least, you are sort of violating the key purpose of the existence of the ISO by doing that. So I just, pricing markets are basically a set of prices. So when you start creating the wrong prices, your market doesn't work anymore. And I think it's really important to think about that when you're going through this and deciding where you're going to price these things.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Next caller, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Doug Bochignone from Flynn Resource Consultants. On this issue of following the dispatch instructions, I think one possible solution would be, in order to be able to accommodate the bearer producing more than the dispatch instruction, is if you would allow the storage resource to deviate from its dispatch instruction in the opposite direction. Essentially absorb that, instead of putting the storage energy onto the grid, you just back down a little and let the bearer get out on the grid, which would be more efficient. And likewise, you could do the same thing in the opposite direction, which at a certain level I think is a bigger concern because of the grid charging restrictions. In other words, if you ever have a situation where the bearer isn't capable of producing to the final 5-minute forecast, so it falls below its dispatch instruction, and that was what was going to be used to charge the storage. If you don't allow the storage to charge less, it effectively is going to be coming from the grid, and that creates an issue.
Yeah, Doug, I don't know that we've spent a whole lot of time thinking about that, but I do think there's a lot of merit to the ideas that you've just laid out there. So we might take that back and just kind of muse over it a little bit and see if we could come up with some sort of a solution there, because it does seem like, that could be sort of an optimal. I mean, that's sort of what you want, right? You want the storage resource to be absorbing excess generation when it can, so that it can put it back out on the grid later. So we'll take that back and consider that, but I think that's good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, the key is the net at the POI would be what you would expect to have received if both resources were capable of following the dispatch instruction.
Right. Yeah, that's
Thanks.
right. That's right. Yeah, thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. Next caller.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead. Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie. I wasn't silent the whole time. They just unmuted my line. I wanted to go back to what Mike was saying really quickly and note that someone else earlier had asked that if we did Mike's idea and assigned the P node at the resource ID level, whether that would be a redo of the market model. And I think if you are going to look into this further, you could, for hybrids, just do it at resource ID level like normal, like you do for every other resource, and then use a parent resource ID for co-located resources. So I don't think you'd actually have to redo the entire market model to go down this path. And I just wanted to lend support for the KISO at least exploring it. I don't know if WPCF would support it or not, but I think it would be a shame to just say this is a draft final proposal without at least seeing if that was an option.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I think we will look into that, and Carrie, I'm trying to follow up with you on it, and we can discuss further. But thank you for that. Appreciate it. Any other callers?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next few slides for metering. So we can go on to advance the next slide, please. Thank you. Just a couple slides here on metering. I know in previous versions of the paper, they were sort of exploring kind of some of the deeper depths into what might or might not work for metering for co-located and hybrid resources. I think the thing that we wanted to simplify the proposal a little bit, and I think we wanted to just exemplify that each resource interconnecting to the ISO will go through the interconnection process with the ISO, and we do review to make sure that we get critical information from our meters and that all the meter locations are acceptable for the information that the ISO needs to get from those meters. So each project is a little bit different, which means each metering configuration could also be a little bit different. And we recognize that there's a lot of questions and uncertainty about this. So just at a general high level for metering, I did want to say a few words about that today, but I didn't necessarily want to go into potentially like every combination of metering that could be out there, because each project is unique and there may be different requirements for different projects. So with that said, the ISO's goal is to require that metering is sufficient so that accurate information can be passed from the meters to the ISO and we can get the information that we need. Hybrid resources will be required to provide meter quality data for energy injected into the grid. So we need to know how much energy is coming off of any particular hybrid resource at any given time, or which could also be a withdrawal from the grid. Each co-located resource will be required to provide meter quality data for energy generated from each resource and aggregate energy injected to the grid. So for co-located resources, it's important for settlement purposes that we do know how much energy is coming off of each resource, and from that information, we should be able to determine how much is actually going on the grid, and then that's going to determine how much each individual resource is getting paid, whereas, of course, the hybrid resource is just one resource, and there's just one settlement process that goes through for those resources. The other key component, and we touched on this a little bit earlier today, but all variable energy resources or components of resources will be required meter data for energy being generated for forecasting and renewable accounting purposes. So that is inclusive of VER resources that have their own resource ID that are co-located, but it also includes VER components of hybrid resources that don't have their own resource ID. The ISO still needs to have metering and telemetry data for those components. So each interconnected resource on the grid is unique. The ISO staff continue to work with interconnection customers to ensure that metering solutions are sufficient to meet these metering requirements. So again, each project is different, and the metering solutions could also be different for each project. But in general, if we move to the next slide, I've just kind of outlined a few very high-level metering diagrams of what this could potentially look like for co-located and hybrid resources. So obviously for co-located resources, you need to have a meter for each resource ID. So on the left here, you can see there's a solar resource, there's a battery resource. You'd have a meter that would sort of be telling you what's coming off the solar at any given time. You'd have a meter telling you what's coming off the battery at any given time. You may also have a meter, because of course this is what the ISO is concerned with, of right at the point of interconnection, determining how much energy is actually being put onto the grid or being taken off of the grid. Now, I think we've heard some comments from folks that say, well, hey, look, I might be able to just have a, metering is expensive equipment. It's possible that I could design a meter at the battery location and a meter at the solar location, or potentially a meter at the solar, meter at the POI, and then from those two meters, I could be able to determine the meter quality data for the battery component of the resource. I think this would be something that would be reviewed by the ISO. If you could, in fact, do it with 2 meters, I think that would be something that, we would review. And then if we also agreed, then that is something that we could approve if we went through that process. So I think that's something to consider. But this also could be a workable situation in order for the ISO to get the metering data it needs. On the right-hand side, you could see a metering configuration for a potential hybrid resource. And I think it's also important to note that, of course, you could have more than just 2 resources, at a single location. But for this one, this could be a hybrid resource. You could have 1 meter on the solar component, so you know how much is coming on and off the VER, which is what the ISO is going to require. And you might also have 1 meter at the point of interconnection. So again, from the information that the ISO is concerned about is how much is coming on off of the solar at any given time, and then how much is being injected or withdrawn at the POI at any given time. Okay, and that's basically all I had on metering, so I'll pause there for any questions.
Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, this is Mike Castellano. I didn't realize I was still in the queue, but I did have a question earlier, or a comment. I think going back to the issue we were talking about a couple minutes ago that I had raised and then Carrie had raised, and talking about, I think it was Alba that said we might need to redesign the network model for that. I think you guys have to do work on the network model either way to get this POI constraint in, and I don't know that it's materially different to determine where the P node is one way or the other in terms of work on the network model. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Like I said, I don't specifically know the answer to that. I will certainly look into it, and next time we meet on this, I'll have an answer. But yeah, I think that's a good point. Any other callers?
Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Bora Akil from 8 Minute again. Couple of questions on this. This particular scenario on slide 26 is using a DC coupled setup. I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware that there are other scenarios where basically it's an AC coupled battery system, and that same metering would apply to that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. And again, I don't think we wanted to go into every possible combination of this, but the ISO agrees, and we would again evaluate that and just make sure we get the information we need from the meters.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment, Laura. I appreciate that. Next caller.
Your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I just wanted to clarify, not to kick a dead horse again, but if each of the things behind the POI are, if they're two hybrid resources instead of a solar and a battery separate, that those are, I'm still a little confused about whether the aggregate, would each of those resources still be allowed to provide ancillary services because hybrids are allowed to, or would they be constrained because they're considered co-located hybrid resources and not be allowed to do the ancillary services? I'm just still a little confused. I apologize.
Yeah, I think the question does get confusing. So when we are planning to implement hybrid resources, we are planning to allow them to provide ancillary services to the market. The current specification co-located resources that stipulates that the Pmax has to be, the sum of the Pmaxes of all the resources behind a POI has to be less than the POI or equal to. That also allows for resources to provide ancillary services. Our model that we're planning to implement for co-located resources that have Pmaxes that are greater than the POI will not allow for those resources to provide ancillary services in between the fall of 2020 and the fall of 2021. So if you fall into that category in that time frame, then I suspect that you wouldn't be allowed to provide ancillary services to the market until fall of 2021, at which point the full constraint would be implemented and you would be allowed to.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand that because I wasn't sure I did. So if there were two hybrid resources behind the constraint and the Pmax of the two exceeded the capacity of the POI, even though hybrids can provide ancillary services, those resources would not be allowed to provide ancillary services until the fall of 2021. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say they're treated as co-located resources, that's part of what you meant.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Susan. Any other callers?
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Tom Watson from Grid SME again. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Tom. Thank you.
Okay. One question. It doesn't really fit cleanly here or really anywhere in today's content, but it's an interconnect issue. We've been chasing specific topics such as pseudo-ties and dynamic resources for these types of, or dynamic schedules for these types of resources. I think you're going to find a fair amount of them are out of state, and we're not having much luck in getting any guidance. In fact, in many cases, we're being pointed back to these proceedings where topics like that really haven't been discussed. We do have a conversation going with a couple of ISO insiders who have pledged to do some research and get back to us. But at the same time, we're kind of looking for some, if you want to call it concrete guidance, but some definitive guidance. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what the appropriate forum to do that is. Like I said, it hasn't really been discussed.
So, Gabe, let me help you out here. Yeah.
Please.
This is Deb Levine. If you could just go ahead and give me a call directly, I can help you out with the dynamic questions that are from external BAs.
Okay. What is your email address, and I'll shoot you my contact information.
It's dlevine, L-E-V as in Victor, I-N-E, @kaiso.com.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Next caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Devon Yusuf. I'm from Centennial Gas and Electric. I just have a quick question about your co-located. I see the third meter there, and you guys are talking about the different configurations, and it's at project basis. But from the last meeting, I remember that third meter was really only required at the POI for ITC benefits, but when it comes to just co-located, treating them as co-located resources, are you guys still going to be requiring that third meter? I know you said it's a given basis, but are you considering requiring that third meter, even if it's not for an ITC benefit?
No, I don't think we'd be making a blanket requirement for that third meter at this time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next call.
Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Dario Mohammadi with California Wind Energy Association. I have a very simple question, especially the questions you've been fielding up to now. And on slide 26, you're showing DC coupled hybrid resource co-located. I was wondering if you even allow co-location with DC coupled resources. In fact, grand majority of co-located resources that I'm aware of are AC coupled. And typically, DC coupled resources are treated as hybrid and are acting as hybrid. But I was wondering, even if you allow DC coupled resources to be considered co-located being on separate meters. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer is yes. We would allow DC coupled resources to be co-located. We recognize that the DC coupling could imply some cost savings for getting the energy from point A to point B, which could be really nice for these resources. And we understand that resources under our hybrid model may also prefer this configuration as well, which isn't to say that we couldn't see AC coupled resources integrate with the system as well under both models. So I think there really is a lot of flexibility into what we can offer for folks who are planning to integrate into the grid. But I think that's a good question. Thank you.
We have no further questions.
Great. Okay. We'll advance to the next topic, which I don't spend a whole lot of time, but I know that this is a fairly complex subject, and we've already fielded a number of RA-related questions, but I did only have one slide on this for today. So essentially, as I've already noted, CPUC does have and is considering in its Track 2 proceeding, how counting rules are going to work for hybrid resources. The ISO has provided comments in that discussion. We're obviously very interested in the outcome of that discussion because it will have implications on, how attractive these resources are and how they could potentially perform and operate in our market. What we do have more control over and we have opinions about are the must-offer obligations and currently today, whether or not they'll be subject to RAIM, and in the future there may be adjustments to these proposals as we move into different later phases of our RA enhancement initiative and begin the changes that we envision there. So essentially, the hybrid resources for co-located resources hybrid and co-located resources will generally have a 24/7 must-offer obligation in the market. This is consistent with many other resources that are currently in our market. Co-located resources will continue to have bidding requirements associated with their resource type. Hybrid resources will have the new dynamic limit tool, which we talked about earlier, to manage their variable output. And then hybrids may use outage cards to indicate on-site charging of storage resources, which will be done without ISO instruction. So we realize, that hybrids sort of want to have this capability to charge their resource from their generation that they have on site, and that the output of the full capability of the resources may not always be available to the ISO. And we want to, first of all, make sure that they have the opportunity to do that, and second of all, allow them to have the tools to do it as well. I think as DMM pointed out, perhaps outage cards aren't the best way to achieve this, So I think as we move forward with the proposal, we'll continue to think about what the best mechanism is, but right now that's sort of where we've landed. Of course, that's in addition to the dynamic limits that we spent a lot of time talking about earlier today. We are planning, again, to have hybrid resources and co-located resources subject to RAIM. And again, we note that RAIM is assessed during the availability assessment hours. Resources that are on outage or not available during these times, of course, this is notwithstanding capability that may not be around because part of your underlying component is a VER component, or potentially, because of VER type issues like the wind isn't blowing or the sun's not shining. So there basically is no RAIM assessment for that, which I think we've talked about including in our outages and with the dynamic limit tools. But then in addition to that, if your resource isn't available for some other reason, so if you've got a hybrid resource and your storage component's not available up to a full amount of that storage component, that could be subject to RAIM and applicable RAIM penalties, which is what we've got outlined here. So with that, I will pause and take questions on the RA components of this.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a couple of questions here. On the last bullet, VARs right now are not subject to RAIM, so you're not suggesting here that they, as a result of this initiative, they would be subject to it, are you?
Correct. That is correct. We're not making that.
Okay. Okay. Again, some of these statements just, I think you probably avoid questions if it was just a little tiny bit of nuance in there. And then I have a question about if a resource is a PCDS resource, say a co-located resources, and because you have a lot of this could happen because people have added storage behind the interconnection through the MMA process, and maybe transferred a bunch of deliverability to storage, but then the storage might not be FCDS, or it could be that now maybe some of it got transferred, but now the solar, for example, could be PCDS. Normally, if it's an FCDS resource, say for solar, they have to offer the entire forecasted output. But if it's a PCDS resource, is there going to be some? I realize that hasn't happened much before, but now it might because of all these the additions and deliverability transfers. If a solar resource, for example, is PCDS and it has a forecasted output of 80 megawatts, and it's say 90% PCDS, so 72 megawatts, if you want to think of it that way, maybe. I mean, how is that addressed in the bidding and must-offer obligations?
I am actually not familiar with the acronym PCDS.
Oh, partial capacity deliverability status. So it means it's not 100% deliverable, so it's not FCDS, which is full capacity.
Okay. Yeah, so, and you're thinking about this in terms of a co-located resource?
Yes, let's say you have a solar and a storage, and the storage was added, as we say, as a result of the MMA process, wasn't there from the beginning, and the solar was FCDS, but now it's transferred, say, some portion of its deliverability to the storage. Yep. So it has deliverability, but not, if it has no deliverability, it's energy only and doesn't even have a must-offer obligation, but it has some deliverability, so it's some fraction of, presumably some fractional amount of something it has to offer. But have you guys thought about how to do that? I know there just haven't been so many of those, but I think as a result of recent changes, you might see that more often.
Yeah, I might not appreciate the nuance of this example, but I suspect things would work fairly similar to the way that they do today. I think the same information coming to the ISO vis-a-vis how much we expect the solar component to produce, paired with a bid curve from the batteries, would sort of get us.
No, that's not. I think you're not getting the. I think you're not getting the situation. Yeah. So, maybe I'll teach you if you do storage. Let's say 100 megawatts of storage, 4-hour storage, which would only have 100 megawatt must-offer obligation, but it only is say 90% deliverable. So it doesn't have a must-offer obligation for the entire amount. It only has a must-offer. So I assume then you'd only expect it to be offering, say, 90 megawatts, because that's that would be its NQC. So that's a pretty straightforward example. But for solar, it's different. You have this forecast, and normally for an FCDS solar resource, whatever the 100% of the forecast is, that's the must-offer requirement. Okay, but if the resource is not FCDS, if it is less than 100% FCDS, deliverable, does it only have to offer a proportional amount of that forecast? That's all. That's the only question. Is that clear? Is that better?
I think that's clear, and I think my answer would be the proportion of the output would be appropriate, but I want to check that out.
Okay, if you could have some clarification on that for co-located resources.
Yeah,
did I cut you off, Debbie? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, for PCDS, in essence, whatever the NQC is what your obligation is going to be.
And for solar or a variable energy resource, that's done on an ALCC. So it's not just it's not like it's a Pmax.
No, I understand it. So the NQC, that's different. So the NQC could be quite a lot less because of the technology factors. So the NQC could be quite a lot less than what the solar might be forecasted to do at a given time. So let's say if you're talking about August, or I forgot July or August, maybe 100 megawatt solar resources might only have, say, a 39 megawatt NQC, and they're forecasted to produce, say, 90 megawatts. So what's their must-offer obligation in that situation?
Their forecast is 90.
And if you throw in, by the way, if they're not FCDS, they're like some portion of that. That's sort of another thing. So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, their obligation is to meet their forecast.
But that's only if they're FCDS, though, right? If they did their forecast. But if they're not FCDS.
Great. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Okay. Well, it would be better, and this is one of the open questions I think about co-located resources. How do things work with PCDS? Because I know you guys are going through all that batch processing of all these resources, and you're going to have PCDS resources. And so, some examples of how that might work, especially if you're going to go to the board with co-located resource issues in July, would be probably a nice idea.
So, Susan, if you could include, maybe like one specific question about this in your written comments, that would be really helpful for me. And I could sit down and sort of go through what the rules are for these specific resources, and then maybe we'd have a good response for that.
Okay. Be happy to do that. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that comment.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, Gabe. This is Michael Volpe from PG&E. Just had a question on this slide. If you could be more specific when you say 24/7 must-offer obligation, is this in real time only, or is there also a day-ahead must-offer obligation?
Yeah, these are both markets. So the resources would be required to bid both in the day-ahead market and the real-time market. And then the standard bidding rules would apply there too. So you'd be able to, in the real-time market, adjust your bids prior to each operating hour. And then similarly for the day-ahead market, you'd be able to submit different bids for each hour of the day.
So there's no difference between a co-located and hybrid in terms of the must-offer obligations. It's both real-time and day-ahead?
Yeah, correct. And frankly, these are rules that are in place for most of the resources that are on the system today. I mean, outside of like the VER resources.
Okay. Yeah, I did see some potential issues with the hybrid day-ahead must-offer, but kind of crunch on that a little bit later.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'd like to talk about those issues because we've kind of been noodling our way through this as well. Yeah. Great. Thank you for the comment, though.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, Susan Schneider again. I'm sorry, I have to do it again. But when you say there's 24/7 a day and it's day ahead, that does not include theirs, which do not have a day ahead must offer obligation right now. You're not going to propose to change that, right?
No, that's correct. Yeah, we wouldn't be changing resources that don't have bidding obligations today. But to the extent that you are a resource that does have a 24/7 must offer obligation today, you're a co-located resource tomorrow, you would still have a 24/7 must offer obligation. That's right.
Okay, thanks very much. That's all I had.
It's a good clarification. Thank you, Susan.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Sonia again, and I want to follow up on the comment that I made earlier, and maybe a discussion would be great, having a more in-depth discussion specifically on the must offer obligation, since we're nearly at the end of the day. But I want to get I have a scenario to pose, and so if say you're a solar plus battery, and your limitation from charging is you're limited to the solar resource. So you charge your battery up during the day, and then you run it for the evening peak and the ramp in the evening peak. And so then, say at 10 p.m., your battery is discharged. What would you say is the must offer obligation at that time until, for the rest of the day and the next day until the solar starts producing again?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we said, for storage resources, even standalone, we are talking about some of these issues in the Azure 4 initiative, and we're talking about some of these issues in the RA enhancement, so they are a little bit spread out. But the idea would be that storage resource in the real-time market would continue to bid, and that might actually be advantageous for the resource because if prices did spike to a particularly high level, and even if it had 5% or 10% state of charge, it may still want to dispatch if prices are sufficiently high, say $250 or $700 or something like that. Similarly, if prices were particularly low, say -100, -150, those resources may want to charge because that's the cheapest time it's going to be able to buy energy, over a potentially 24-hour period. So in the real time market,
my understanding is that that the ITC restriction is a fairly significant restriction, and that resources wouldn't want to put that in jeopardy, and so that would be a real restriction at the end of the day. So even if you have, say, a 5% state of charge left, how would you expect that to cover all the bids if prices went high? I guess it gets to my point where if you're having a charging restriction and in the CPUC, you're having an NTC that's going to be lower that sort of incorporates the fact that you have a charging restriction. I'm trying to understand why it's reasonable to have the expectation of the 24/7 must-offer obligation.
Yeah, I think that's an artifact of what we have set up in the markets today for most resources on the grid. The idea is, and I can appreciate that this is different, but if you've got a gas resource, the idea is you bid that gas resource 24/7. You might not always be in the money, and the ISO might not always dispatch you. But if you've been procured through the RA process, and the ISO has sort of banked on your energy being there and available, and if you're short enough start duration from a gas resource, we would expect you to be bidding on the market, and when prices are sufficiently high, if they're sufficiently high, they get dispatched. I think we're very much sort of on the same line with storage resources. If we're counting on storage resources to be a meaningful component of resource adequacy, and the ISO is counting on those megawatts of capacity to be available to the ISO for dispatch, then we want the megawatts of those resources to be available for the ISO for dispatch. Now we realize that resources may not always be in the money, and just because prices are low at one point doesn't necessarily mean that you have to charge your battery. We're still going to do that economically. And then in addition to that, if I really am a resource and I'm nervous about my ITC credits and I want to make sure that I get those ITC credits no matter what, you can self-schedule the resource. You can put in an outage charge for the resource. And there's a lot of different ways to manage these things so that they're sort of doing what you want them to do. But the idea for the resource adequacy program is that, these resources are available to the ISO when we need to dispatch resources.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and I think there just may need to be further thinking if there is a true restriction for the charging on the charging side, because just like a solar resource, even if it has an RA amount that's derived by its ELCC, it wouldn't be available at midnight, regardless of the fact that it's an RA supply plan. There may have to be an additional consideration here, especially if the NQC is different. These resources may be different from a standalone battery. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment. Appreciate it.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Noah from Olivine. If you, so since you're not honoring any state of charge, you're not paying attention to the state of charge for a hybrid resource, does that mean if a hybrid resource depleted the battery, due to economic discharge during the day, they'd have to be on outage until they charge again? The resource would have to submit an outage?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that gets back to a slide that I had very early on that kind of stated, hybrid resources are responsible for managing their internal components of the hybrid resources. And to the extent that they are bidding into the ISO's market, if they have a solar resource that's capable of producing 0 megawatts because it's nighttime, and they have a storage resource that's capable of producing 0 megawatts because it's fully depleted and has 0 megawatt hours of state of charge, then we would expect to see a bid curve potentially for the charging component of the resource, and then we would expect to see an outage card or, potentially an update in the dynamic limit, but probably an outage card that says, hey, look, my resource is offline because I don't have any state of charge, something like that, yeah.
So suppose that, there was RAIM assessed from 4 to 9, and it's a 4-hour battery, and it turns out that the most economic time to discharge is from 4 to 8 p.m., so they'd be assessed RAIM for that last hour, which wouldn't happen if it was a co-located resource.
Well, I would sort of disagree with that, because if you're a co-located resource and you're a storage component and you have no state of charge, then you can't bid into the market during that last hour either.
Well, but the ISO, that's the ISO optimization doing that, though, right? It wouldn't be subject to RAIM if it's because ISO optimization depleted the battery.
I mean, we can think about some more specific examples of this, but yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's a good point. We should probably think about that a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that these hybrid resources would also have the capability to sort of bid the same way as storage, in that they'd have a negative component of their bid and a positive component.
Right.
I'm not quite sure between the interplay between the two with what you're talking about. So I think we'll have to look into that and think about that a little bit more. But I suspect, we're still thinking about the 24/7 construct here.
I mean, maybe you could have an energy limit somehow that's tied to the dynamic limit, so that you have some conception of how it's being depleted. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, Gabe, this is John. Yeah, that's complicated because there's so many factors of how the operator managed the battery, self-scheduled, set state of charges, things like that, that to try to unwind it, that, you know, who's to blame for running out of, you know, charge during the availability assessment hours can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah, and I do think it's a good point. We should probably think about this a little more.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next caller.
Your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to point out in relationship to the last conversation that you would want the storage resource to be depleted at or near the end of the availability assessment hours, at least theoretically, right, because that's the optimum use for the storage resource. So I don't think that saying that you're going to give them rain penalties for being used in an optimal way really makes much sense. Just wanted to add a weight to that.
Yeah, I think we need to, thanks, Carrie. I think we need to take a look at that, think about it a little bit more. Next comment, please.
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, great. So I believe I'm on the last slide of the presentation here, so thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. Essentially, these are just some, so the previous slide, if you would, please. Thank you. Essentially, just a few more notes here that sort of didn't fit into any of the topics above. Prior to the introduction of the hybrid resources, the ISO is planning to require that non-generator resources that include VER components report forecast data and high sustainable limits to the ISO. So this is not a rule that's in place today, but sort of in the interim when we might have resources joining the market and they're modeled as NGR resources, but before we have the definition of hybrid resource in place, if there are components of those resources that are VER components, then we do want to include or be receiving forecast data, and again, this could be provided by the ISO or provided by the resource owner, and we want to get the high sustainable limits from those resources. So that is something that we're planning to implement in the fall of 2020 when the POI constraints go live. The ISO is also not foreseeing any new changes to settlements. Like we were talking about earlier, co-located resources continue to be settled independently. So if you've got resource A and resource B that are settled independently today, they'll continue to be settled independently in the future. Each hybrid resource will also have its own resource ID that will also be settled on its own with its own big curve and its own price and its own energy that gets discharged from the hybrid resource. And we talked about how we got settlement meter quality data to be used in that settlement process. We've also noted that in this forum and in other forums, folks are starting to talk about hybrid resources and potential for those resources to exercise market power. The ISO continues to work on a proposal for mitigation for storage, and that's something that we're doing in the ESDR 4 initiative. And that could potentially inform a potential mitigation for hybrid resources here in this initiative or successive initiatives, likely successive initiatives. We do acknowledge that, you know, with several thousands of megawatts of potentially hybrid resources, that could be obviously hybrid or co-located resources or independent standalone storage, you know, they could have the ability to exert market power. And if they have the ability to exert market power, we want to have good market power mitigation measures in place to address that. So we continue to be aware of that possibility. But in the same vein, the ISO is going to continue to retain the authority to review generator information. So if we do see resources gaming or, you know, potentially bidding in manipulative ways, we can, you know, kind of flag that, and we can reach out and talk to individual generators. Similarly, DMM also has authority and will continue to monitor for these kinds of gaming and manipulative behaviors. So while we don't have market power mitigation in place per se today for these resources, we still do have the tools and the authority to review and watch for that kind of behavior. And if we do find any of these instances of this behavior, we do have the authority to refer these resources to FERC. So with that, that's all I had. I will pause one more time for final questions, and then we will conclude the call for today.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi, Gabe. Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I didn't understand your first point where you said prior to hybrids, these things would be mandated. What about the resources right now that are going through that are being set up as hybrids? Are these obligations now that we have to worry about? I'm confused on the timing.
Yeah, so we don't have a definition for hybrid in our tariffs today. That's what we're working on through this initiative. We do have resources, as you mentioned, that are interconnecting into our grid today, and those are going through the modeling process with master files. Those resources, some of them are being modeled as NGR resources under our current rules, and to the extent that we have resources that are being modeled as NGRs that have VER components, we will be requiring that those VER components do submit forecast information for the ISO for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, so that we have the information of what energy is coming off of those resources, the VER resources.
Yep. So, but then it sounded like you were saying this would be implemented when you implemented the hybrid. Like, what mechanism are you requiring this? Like, is this going to be a PPM?
Do
you understand what I'm saying?
This would be part of the. Yeah, I do. This would be part of the tariff changes that go in place that would coincide with the changes for the fall 2020 release of the POI constraint. So it wouldn't be, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Gary. Good clarification there. Appreciate that. Next caller.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Bora from 8 Minute again. I wanted to ask a question regarding grid charging or control of grid charging. So we discussed this a lot in the hybrid single resource ID scenario. In the previous version of the proposal, there was a section on how you can control grid charging of two resource ID scenario. And clearly in that scenario, right, that you don't have the ability to say, my resource is only allowing positive discharge, positive output, because fundamentally then you will never be able to charge it. So what is the best way, in your opinion, for the storage resource to bid or self-schedule or something into the market so that it is able to charge from the on-site solar but not from the grid?
And you're thinking about co-located resources?
Yeah, two resource ID, co-located resources. There's solar and storage, and I want to charge my storage only from the on-site solar for, again, due to ITC for the first 5 years. And I'd like to know what is the best way, in your opinion, to do that?
Yep. So the co-located resources will be treated independently in the eyes of the ISO. So we will have visibility into the solar component and their bid curve, and we will have visibility into the storage component and their bid curve. The ISO will realize that so today in the market, generally the lowest priced hours of the day, the hours that storage resources would find advantageous to be charging from the grid are the periods when the peak amount of solar is online. And then the highest priced hours of the day, so ideally the periods and hours when resources would ideally be discharging, are generally in the peak net load hours, which is after the solar is offline. So we really are set up in a pretty good space to be able to take advantage of the abilities of both of these resources, and the economics are there to do that. So essentially, if I'm bidding in my storage resource in such a way that I'm getting scheduled to charge my storage resource at the same time I'm getting scheduled to produce energy or provide energy from the VER resource, the ISO will still see a discharge instruction from the solar component or a general instruction for the solar component to produce as capable, which is what it will be doing most of the time, and then it will be seeing an instruction for that storage resource to charge. And I've talked internally to some folks in legal, and they seem to think that one could make a fairly compelling case that, hey, if my resource, my solar resource here at a co-location is generating and my storage resource is storing at the same time, these things are happening at the same time, you can make a pretty good case that your storage resource is essentially charging from the solar resource and be eligible for the ITC credit. I think this is very doable in our current market. I think this is very doable in our current market. First of all, you could specifically explicitly self-schedule the storage component to charge during particular hours when you know the solar's online. But you can also bid this economically and say, hey, anytime prices are less than $25, I want my resource to charge, and then every day as the sun comes up and the solar comes online, which depresses prices across the entire grid, and prices go below $20 or $25, then you start to charge the resource, and then you can make this argument, hey, my solar resource was generating, my storage resource was charging, this is happening at the same time.
Okay.
Does that help at all?
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, it does help. It would be nice if there's a future revision, if there's an example like you had for your limits, I forgot the name of it already, but the one for the hybrid resource, the limit tool.
Yep.
It would be nice if you had an example like that for the co-located resource, but I think I got the gist of it, so thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. Good question. Next question, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, it's Eric. I'm sorry if I missed this, but I didn't see the slide in here that thoroughly discussed the co-located resources may submit bids only from a single scheduling coordinator. Did you go over that and I just missed it? I know it came up at the very beginning, but you were only dealing with schedule at that point, so I didn't address it then.
Yeah, it was in there. Yeah, we are planning to, the current proposal does state that co-located resources would need to be managed by a single scheduling coordinator. And the reason being is that our operations team is concerned that we may not be able to, do things like exceptional dispatch and be mindful of the POI limits at co-located resources, which may not be modeled in the operations toolbox. So the idea would be that instead of having to pick up the phone and potentially call 2 or more scheduling coordinators because that's who's managing these resources behind one POI, you pick up the phone to call one scheduling coordinator and they'd be able to get, the right operating procedure to get either more megawatts or less megawatts from their subset of resources while sort of enforcing that POI, which the operators might not have visibility into.
Okay, so Gabe, I'm pretty sure that everybody's aware of the press release that has been put out of some 700 megawatts of battery storage, and you can bet that some of that at least is co-located. We were entering into those contracts on the basis of what the discussion was last time around, where this restriction was not there. This is causing huge amounts of concerns in doing those contracts, and if the concern really is not having the visibility for things like exceptional dispatch, I think we we ought to be looking at ways to improve the ISO systems so that the ISO system has the information in it so that the dispatchers are aware of it. If that's going to take a while to implement, I would suggest that we figure out how much of this there is going to be in the immediate future, because I don't think it's a large number of resources. It may be quite a few megawatts, but not a large number of resources, and perhaps there is a manual workaround for, the first year or so while the technology at the ISO gets upgraded to be able to automate that process. There's a lot of people out there who are doing procurement to meet the 3,300 megawatt mandate required by IRP, and you can bet some of it's going to be battery storage and some of that's going to be co-located and some of it's going to be hybrid. To stop that process from moving forward because people started entering into contracts under the understanding that you could have 2 scheduling coordinators, going to make that very, very difficult. As you can imagine, when you've got a co-located battery with a renewable, it's not the norm that it's the same owner of the 2 different resources. So having one scheduling coordinator is not an automatic. It's not something that is necessarily easy to do. You're expecting coordination between 2 entities that, quite frankly, on the grid for energy purposes are competitors. So I'm not sure that it really works out that well. So I would encourage the ISO to really look at whether or not there's a workaround that they can do immediately to allow the 2 scheduling coordinators, and for the future to look at the possibility of upgrading the systems that you have to automate that process such that exceptional dispatch with 2 resources and 2 different scheduling coordinators at the same POI is not a problem.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take that feedback back internally at the ISO and just kind of rediscuss that. I would also encourage you, Eric, and other market participants out there to include this feedback in your commentary, just so we get a good gauge of how critical this really is.
Yeah, we absolutely will, and I thank you for considering it. Do appreciate that there's been a lot of work going into this. I just hate to have something like a worry about exceptional dispatch, which happens relatively infrequently. And for, in this case, by August 1st of next year, a relatively small number of resources in total to have the entire thing held up because of this type of requirement. So I'd like for us to think of other ways around it if it's possible. So we'll submit it in our comments. Appreciate you guys thinking about it.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. Next comment, please.
Your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Tom Watson from Grid SME again. Couple of questions. I apologize if this has been covered, but my phone has dropped twice over the duration of this call. The term net to grid operational forecast, that's no more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not currently thinking about employing that term at this time. I do think some of the same concepts are kind of folded into this proposal, but I think, we might have created additional confusion there that may not have been necessary. I would just point out, and I think, we have addressed this earlier, but we are planning on, requiring that resources now report to the ISO high sustainable limits. And these are going to be essentially telemetered values of expected potential output from VER resources going forward, which kind of was akin to the definition that was raised earlier for that term.
Okay, and these, I think you were calling them dynamic limits earlier in the presentation. That's another aspect of this.
Yeah. That's right. Okay. Yeah, and then I didn't. Yes.
Okay, and on the last slide there was discussion about providing, SCs providing the VER component forecast data for a hybrid resource, which is consistent with the straw proposal from late last year. Mm-hmm. Is it still being considered as an option to have the ISO provide that component?
Yes.
Okay. So it could be provided
by the ISO is still going to option. Sorry about that. I couldn't hear you.
It could be developed by the SC or by the ISO.
Absolutely correct. Yep.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Next caller.
Your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I wanted to echo FTE's and Eric's admonition to please go take a look at that exceptional dispatch software or process, and if that is really the big, I don't recall seeing that in the written proposal, but if that is really the big concern here, go ahead and fix that, because that's, I know it's easy for me to say, but that seems like a very big, a bit of a tail wagging the dog potentially. So I can support SE on that. And then so I had a couple of other things. The high sustainable limit is something that, first of all, as I mentioned before, has not been well defined in terms of what it means, and if it requires NTRs with their components to install additional equipment, would they still have to comply with that?
I think we should be careful about this, but primarily I do think that but I do think that from the way we've described this and how we've talked about it in the paper, essentially what we're thinking about is a telemetered estimate of how much capability could come off of a VER resource at any given time. So if you've got a solar resource, it's going to be a real-time estimate of what that solar can produce. I think we'd have to get some folks from forecasting on the phone to go into the specifics of the kind of technology you need to actually make those estimations. But that's those are the drivers there.
Yeah, but I guess the thing is the last time it wasn't explained, and so I don't think we do have a feel for what is even needed here. There was some discussion about whether additional equipment might be needed, and it's not clear what that is. I guess I think you just need more work in this. I mean, it's just not a very basic concept the way it's been presented. So, it looked like all the information you were going to get from this you already had from a combination of the interconnection agreement, because you know how much is installed, or the meteorological data because you know how much is, you have that data. So it wasn't clear what additional things you were trying to get at here, and what additional, and it was, I believe the description last time was, well, there might be some piece of equipment that might have to be installed. It just wasn't explained.
Yeah, I think that's fair feedback. I will absolutely be working on that in between this iteration and next iteration. Thank you.
Okay, and I've got one more question. I don't want to make your head explode, but this dynamic limit tool, which for a hybrid would allow you to, between that and outage cards, would allow you to accommodate storage or charging the storage from the on-site solar. Is there some reason that kind of tool could not also be used, kind of going to Bora's question, that it could not also be used for a co-located resource situation? Because some of those will also have ITC limitations, and so it does seem like you might be able to do that.
I think there's a potential to do that, but I'm not sure there's as big of a need to do that. So those resources, for the storage resources that are going to be co-located, the ISO will have the information on state of charge, and it will know, what happens from interval to interval. If I dispatch the resource now versus dispatching it in 20 minutes, it can make those trade-offs. We don't have the state of charge value for hybrid resources, so we can't make those same trade-offs for the resources. Additionally, I think for the hybrid resources, this is trying to capture that variability from your variable generating piece, whereas your variable generating piece is sort of independent from the storage piece when we're thinking about co-located resources.
I understand, but for example, the must-offer obligation for solar requires you to offer the full, at least if it's an FCDS resource, requires you to offer the full forecasted capacity of the storage or capability of the storage. And if you were solar, I apologize, the full forecast ability of the solar. And so if you want to use the solar for some of the time to charge the storage, there isn't any real way to, I know you can try and manage things back and forth, but there's no direct way to really communicate your desire to do that. And you can try and manage it through the bids, but I'm just wondering if there was any other way that the dynamic tool, if it proved useful to people, could be used for co-located resources.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment, and I think one of the themes that I tried to articulate at the beginning of the call was just that, these are emerging technologies. We don't know, we have ideas about how we think these things are going to work in the future, but we don't know exactly. The ISO is still very much in the learning phase. As we get more of these resources on the grid, we will learn more, and as we learn more about what tools do and don't work, I think it's very likely that we might be back in a forum like this again, where we're talking about implementing, better, improved tools to allow resources to do exactly the kinds of things that you're proposing here.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That's all I've got.
Okay. Well, thank you for the comment. I appreciate it. Next caller, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, this is Adam Swadley from DMM. Dave, I just had a timing question for you. So on the subject of market power mitigation, there's a line in the paper that says that it's not being considered now, but will be likely included in a future version of the Hybrid Resources Initiative. I was just wondering if you had a sense of what that timing looks like when you say future version. Is it something maybe later this year after the portion of the proposal that goes to the July board, maybe that's taken up in the fall or something, or is it something that you see being like years into the future?
Well, I certainly hope it's not years in the future. I do think part of it is going to have to do with ISO capability to integrate and implement some of these tools. I think it might also be worth our while to get a little bit of experience for how these things are actually working on the grid. But by the same token, we can't wait too long because we do need to get these things in place eventually, particularly if there's going to be a lot of this stuff on the grid. So unfortunately I don't have a great feel for an answer for your question. But I do think there will be some urgency on this particular topic at the ISO after the conclusion of this part of the proposal. So, November of next year, I think, we'll start to look at this pretty seriously.
Okay, so that's helpful. I asked to have a sense of where the ISO is on this because I think it's an important thing to keep track of, and especially given that it does seem like there is some good opportunity to leverage what's happening in ESDR 4. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think that's a very good comment. Appreciate it. I will just
we have no further questions at this time.
Oh, I was going to say, I think we have a hard cutoff here at 3, but it seems like we're not going to need that. Okay, Jimmy, do you want to conclude, please?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe, and thanks, folks, for being mindful of your comments here toward the end, and we appreciate your attendance, of course. As mentioned, you can look out for the recording for this to be available in the next couple of business days. And once more, we appreciate all of the comments and suggestions. A lot of good suggestions raised, of course, especially surrounding the point of interconnect and multiple versus single SC issue for our co-located P, so we appreciate that. We do ask that you please have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, stay happy, and we look forward to your comments, which, as you can see, as mentioned earlier, will be due on May 28th. As John mentioned, we do, want to submit them earlier, it'd be appreciated, but we did give the extension due to the COVID crisis, so felt that was justified. But of course, with the MSC meeting on the 29th, it would be nice to have those early. So please have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.